It takes a big personality to be the executive in charge of America's Got Talent, The Voice and The Apprentice. But this week's guest, Paul Telegdy, was exactly the kind of person to thrive in that environment. In this week's episode of Here Comes Pod, Paul talks about his early days in the international TV business, how a British ballroom dancing format helped to launch the BBC and his entry into the US TV market, the challenges of managing high-performing talent, and his new venture, the Whole Spiel. And as we reminisce about Elvis-inspired TV shows, it's a little more conversation with Paul Telegdy. Enjoy. Hi Paul, welcome to the pod.
Hello, Danny. I'm seeing you, but I'll say nice to hear your voice again.
Well, lovely to have you on board. I always like to start with a fun question to get the creative juices flowing. And for you, my question is this. If you were picking 4 contestants, what would be your dream Dancing with the Stars lineup?
Gosh, I was thinking about that like for 2023. And of course, because it's a competition, I was thinking, well, who's sort of, out there being competitive? And, just as you hear the sort of bravado of Mark Zuckerberg and Elon Musk preparing for a cage fight, which to me, the idea of seeing either of those men in a wrestling outfit in a ring, I would much rather see Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg face off in the ballroom. And we've always had a bit of luck with businessmen on the show back in the day. Mark Cuban was an early contestant. He's obviously gone on to be hugely famous and was already successful as a businessman. And I then even thought, well, let's see how Jeff Bezos makes it out there on the dance floor as well. I think he looks like a bit of a groover and a mover. So I thought, well, those would be relevant to us in the business, maybe Jeff Bezos and Tim Cook. And then I thought from the world of sports, he's taken America by storm. And I don't know whether that's going back across the Atlantic. But of course, Lionel Messi, dances on the pitch. Maybe we'd like to see him in the ballroom. And then I was really thinking about, if you give me permission, I'd like to bring someone back to the show just because I miss them. And that's Robin Williams. I always thought he would have been like an ultimate contestant and the public loves him. And I miss him dearly. So let's say, I'll bring back Robin Williams. I'd like to see Lionel Messi dance and possibly Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg. Is that a good selection?
Yeah, fantastic. I wonder if Messi would have a particular advantage in the tango, but we'd have to see.
Certainly. The Latin dances for our Argentinian friend probably would give him an unfair advantage.
Were you a big fan of TV growing up? And if so, did that include the kind of entertainment programming as well as the dramas and comedies that you became synonymous with?
I think my television watching history is slightly unusual because I lived overseas. I didn't live in England or Britain, so I wasn't watching British TV that much unless I was at my grandma's house. And yes, my grandma was a huge Angela Rippon and Come Dancing fan. So I've been exposed to ballroom dancing almost tied to my seat in the same way my granny loved wrestling. I would watch ballroom dancing with her. But I wouldn't say those were the kinds of shows that I was watching. I grew up in Europe, so I watched an awful lot of television dubbed into German. I was in Switzerland and Austria. And so I'd be watching like LWT shows like The Professionals, I'd be watching in German, called Die Profis. So I fell in love with TV because TV was my teacher as well. People used to ask me, how did you learn German? I learned it from the television. I mean, I was a little boy watching television in German. And it's genuinely how I learned to speak German. So TV's been a big part of my life in that way. And obviously, my first proper job was in telly. And I got that straight out of university. So I've been in or around the TV business since I was literally a first jobber. And growing up, watched way too much telly in a house where my grandma did call it the idiot box.
How did you get into the TV business?
Well, funny, it's probably someone you know from the business. I was at a friend's 21st birthday party at a slightly unsalubrious bar. I was miserable in my existing employment. I was known for being someone that spoke a few languages. I'd just been to university studying Japanese and Korean and spoke English, German, and French. And this chap comes up to me and introduces himself. He's a mutual friend. I never met him before. And says, hello, I hear you're looking for a job. I was like, yeah. He goes, you speak languages, don't you? Yeah. He goes, oh, well, I've been promised a case of wine if I can find a new PA come Monday. And I don't know if you know Charlie Farmer from MGM. It was Charlie. And I became Charlie's assistant, working at Richard Price Television Associates. By the way, I did that for 4 or 5 years. I was a hardcore salesman, traveling around. I had the Asia beat, which from London meant that I was gone for January and February. Once you're out on the road, you stay out on the road when you've gone that far. But what a brilliant thing to be doing in your early 20s, going to MIP and MIPCOM, traveling around the world, really understanding how different audiences are around. It was a fascinating insight into global television. I knew that I needed to get closer to the program making and origination business and get closer to program makers. And part of that was because if you'd been in the sales business, whenever you met a producer or anyone in the creative business, that was the person who got the most amount of attention from everyone. We had a whole producer reporting department that was just there to keep producers happy. I was like, I've got to be closer to those people because they're coming up with the ideas. Plus, most of them don't know much about what audiences around the world are actually looking for. I mean, almost provably so, clueless. They just, so I went and got a job at the BBC, initially applied for a job, which I didn't get because I didn't know that at the BBC it was a foregone conclusion that if a job was being advertised, they'd already filled it. So I was just being panelled for a job that had already been filled. But I caught the eye of the executives at the BBC that were hiring the job I didn't get. And they said, will you take over the job that's been vacated by the person that got the job you went for? I said, yeah. They said, don't you want to know what it is? I'm like, no, I've got to work at the BBC. The BBC was everything. Culturally, in terms of if you wanted to be serious about a career in television at the time, it was Auntie Beeb or nothing, really. Because back then, that was television in the UK. I mean, you've got to remember, it's still a fragmented ITV buying market where you were probably at those meetings where Jeff Ford was trying to, keep the lunatics under control as you had bread rolls thrown at you by 10 different ITV buyers. Obviously, from going into distribution, I'd seen how much bigger and better the US stands were and how much better the suits and shoes and wristwatches were of our American colleagues. So I always thought, well, one might go back to, one might sort of tackle the US market one day. That would be fun. But I went into the BBC and working for what I describe as the odds and sods of every department. Music entertainment, which at the time was trying to get Top of the Pops off as a global brand, which subsequently happened. Entertainment, which was at the BBC split between comedy and light entertainment. And light entertainment would be the dancing, quiz shows, game shows, variety shows. And comedy was sketch and sitcom. And at the time, those were run by John Plowman and Jeffrey Perkins, which was like, you're in the presence of comedy geniuses going to meetings saying, maybe I can help you get some more money for this, or have you spoken to this? And at the time, the BBC was all about producer choice. So BBC Worldwide was not always the distributor of choice at the time. And I think it was just become BBC Worldwide from BBC Enterprises. And my job was basically hustling for the entertainment department and the music entertainment department. And then BBC Pebble Mill in Birmingham, which was bastion of what I can only describe as sort of factual entertainment and lifestyle programming. They made Gardener's World and Pebble Mill at One and all kinds of low-cost afternoon programming.
In 2004, your job at the BBC took you to LA. What was the brief? And what was and is the perception of the BBC in the US market?
After I'd proved my mettle in a few businesses, I got the drama co-pro job. I was head of co-productions for drama, entertainment, and children's programming, basically. And that had involved, on the drama side, increasingly, telling your bosses, look, I've got to go to LA for a week, got a lot going on. Telegdy sunning himself, it always happened to be in January or February or whatever. But actually, Jane Tranter and the drama team at BBC had high ambitions for one. Jane had rightly spotted that we were completely beholden on the period drama side to WGBH in Boston, which had finite resources, fantastic long-term partner for anyone producing those kind of British dramas, but not enough given the ambitions that we had to scale up and do interesting things that cost more money. And it was brutal. But HBO at the time had Colin Callender running HBO Films, and they were starting to evolve their understanding of their own original programming slate, coming off, obviously massively successful first stabs at things like Sopranos and Sex and the City, but what would more originals look like? And we started a sort of slate of films with HBO Films. And they were quite a lot of shuttle diplomacy around the business dealings, but also the creative. And the kind of, while we're talking to HBO, shouldn't we knock on the door of a few other people? And it became sort of like legendary sales stories, and a lot of fun was had. And I said to my bosses, I feel like I'm always coming back just as it's getting interesting. I'm in a car on the way to LAX, and I really need the week after and the week after that to follow up and really dig in. And they're like, oh, so you want to go for even longer to LA, Paul? And Rebecca Siegel had left to go to Sky. And there was an empty desk, quite literally, in LA. And Rupert Gavin and Anne Yentop, and the managing director of BBC Worldwide Sales at the time, called me and said, get your Bombay bowler, which is such a strange colonial reference. You're going to the colonies was kind of the joke. Apologies. And I turned up a month before the LA screenings in 2004 with the acquisitions brief and the co-productions brief and the sales brief, which is kind of ironic, both poacher and gamekeeper at the same time. And I remember actually you were there that first year, you were working for Sony. And it was like, so what happens at the LA screenings is that, and probably different at the BBC because I understand, fewer people travel around the world doing things, but quite a large buying team would come from the UK. You're nodding because you remember the door opening it being the BBC crew. And at any point, that could be some very director of television, channel controllers, but also the acquisitions team. And that was an incredibly useful way to have on-the-lot access to all of the main studios. And funny enough, you were working at Sony at the time. And bluntly, I literally fell in love with your lot.
Nothing to do with me, in fairness.
Well, no, all I remember is spilling a very milky latte on the very expensive carpet in your screening rooms and getting in quite a lot of trouble. But I then made a deal on behalf of the BBC with what was then Columbia TriStar Television and Sony. Like all the domestic television businesses were sort of being crushed together. And the guy I made the deal with left quite promptly, but Zach and Jamie, who now run Apple TV, were the bosses there. And we were suddenly we were buying shows through the set, obviously through you, but we were suddenly making shows, whatever that meant from a format point of view. Obviously very tentative, and BBC branching out to try and do something different, because we'd always just licensed formats and watch people, and I suppose The Office would be the best example of that. Watch an enormous amount of people run off into the sunset, for better or for worse, probably for better. The US office is far bigger than the UK office and has made a lot of people very happy and very rich. But the BBC felt like it has, lost a lot of equity, literally creative equity, financial equity, and reputational equity, at the point at which something that was conceived of on the fourth floor of Television Centre by very bright comedians and managed, fostered by John Plowman, goes on to be sequentially probably, I don't know, $5 billion to $6 billion worth of commerce on an individual title. I'm not sure what the absolute number is, but huge for The Office. And the BBC would probably be the smallest participant in that.
Yeah, I do remember we had that show that had been set in Blackpool about the singing.
That is the most shared meme. Viva Laughlin. You're about to. Did you actually have to go out and sell that?
Of course. The show that made it to one episode. And by the way, we had shows that didn't even make it to one episode. They got cancelled before airing. So that wasn't even the worst. But I do remember that was a byproduct of the BBC,
Well,
the nascent BBC relationship.
honestly, it just shows you how fucking terrible I was at my job back then. Because one, Bob Greenblatt, who was then running Showtime, he wanted that show and he wanted it bad. And Bob Lowry was the writer, had just written Huff for Showtime.
That was a good show.
Yeah, Bob Greenblatt knew about Blackpool, Viva Blackpool, and he knew we were coming out, and obviously because it had a strong musical component, he loved it and he wanted to do it. Sony couldn't do a pay TV deal at the time. I mean, this is how the world has changed. Can you imagine turning down a pay TV deal? Why? Oh, it doesn't fit with our ultimate economics. We're much, if we're going to do, we want to sell it to a network. And this is before Breaking Bad, before they'd gone up and done things like that. Like, well, I don't know, it doesn't really feel like a very CBS show. And Nina loves it. I know, man. Of course, I've talked to her about it. She loves it. She absolutely loves song and dance. Plus, CBS had just done this really big deal with Hugh Jackman, and he was happy to attach himself after a jolly dinner at the Peninsula. But turning down Bob at Showtime was a sort of epically terrible decision in a career. But it wasn't. It was. I won't put it on me. It was just like, oh no, we don't do Showtime shows. We do network shows, and the results were just like it's almost a book in one show. I was just talking to one of the people that had their first job as a writer's assistant on the series writers' room of Viva Laughlin, and being cancelled while your first episode is airing, and also that it was delayed, and it was delayed a week for some reason, or some CSI preemption, or something. I can't remember what it was, but we were having our sort of premiere party while I got an email saying the show was cancelled as it was airing. Man, I can tell you, BBC expenses department in Cardiff did not like the bar bill from that night. But the writers were then evacuated as a result of a wildfire. So the whole thing was sort of had this brilliant curse at the heart of it. But yeah, no, you learn a lot from the ones that are, you become a literal laughingstock. That title is a laughingstock, and probably one of the top 50 worst decisions ever by executives.
It was certainly fun trying to sell it, but we did our best, and I'm sure everybody who was there remembers that, alongside many other top quality.
If you couldn't sell it, no one could, is probably the truth.
So you're in LA on behalf of the BBC, and you're combining these roles, and then a UK ballroom dancing format, which started out in the 1940s, put you and the BBC on the map in Hollywood. How did that all come about?
Wayne Garvey, who is a great friend, and he was then the head of entertainment. He succeeded Paul Jackson. Wayne always been friendly because he is just a wonderful open personality, and he wasn't like a lot of other BBC executives. But Wayne calls me up and says, and by the way, there'd been a previous attempt to sell the format. So we had a format sales department at BBC Worldwide, and they had unsuccessfully shopped the format with a kind of, oh, look, it's really working kind of strategy. And Wayne calls me, I'm like, please don't make me go out with that again. Come on, they've already said no to it. He said, well, Richard Hopkins, sorry, rest in peace. Richard Hopkins was the head of light entertainment at the BBC, who went on to be an independent producer and passed at an incredibly young age. But Richard was a force of nature. And David Mortimer, who now runs Scottish STV Studios, David was factual entertainment, and I don't know how they sort of differentiate, but Richard was shiny floor. And Wayne said, well, look, we'll turn it into a twofold sales trip. David wants to come as well. And guess what? It was January or February, like, so get out of London and set up this, set meetings. And I just give enormous credit to Richard, who was a passionate producer who we went and we did the tour. And you know what? Every single one of the broadcasters was reconsidering it because the producer had got on a freaking plane. And Richard came in and persuaded Andrea Wong at ABC to buy the show. That's one thing. The thing that we persuaded ABC was that we had an operating production company at Los Angeles that could take on what at the time was a mammoth, absolute groundbreaking production exercise, and in quite a short turnaround, when in fact all we were was like a fish tank and some shelves in Burbank, and luckily the BBC actually had a lot of doers. And it was like a few quick phone calls to like heads of production in London, with one guy coming over, hiring employee number 2. And employee number 2 was epically experienced production manager that enabled us to be a production company on day 3 and accept the order. Then, with enormous headwinds at the network, because the network president at the time really hated this genre of programming, like almost pathologically. And we always had a slightly fiery relationship as a result of that, because I'm delighted, because he ended up doing a ballroom dancing bit at the upfront with one of the dancers, Steve. He hated that show at first. Even as it was airing the first season, I was getting slightly snippy emails. And then I remember I was taking my dog for a walk, because the ratings used to come in, used to call a phone line to get I forget what they're called, not the fast nationals, but the first, local people meters. God almighty, I sound like 1,000 years old. Calling a phone number to hear a recorded message of the ratings from Nielsen. And I was like, come again? And I had no clue what it meant. Then I got a call from our agent at the time, Greg Lipstone. It was William Morris, later went to ICM, done a bunch of things, but Greg was our guy. And it was like, you don't understand. This is massive. I haven't seen a 5.8 rating in the summer not even for a sports event. Whatever happened is a phenomenon. Hold on tight. That was after one episode. He was like, don't worry. This is our bums in butter is not what he said, but it's what I was thinking at the time. And not least because then the subsequent episode order and then the expansion of the show, the generalized economics as a production company for that show, there was a moment in time where you could not make more money if you tried. I've never seen a cost to ROI expressed in a production company the way we were making money then. I mean, I'm talking nearly 100% margin on some episodes, maybe more on some episodes. And so it became this black hole of activity in terms of not black hole's the wrong word, but like some sort of very strong magnetic force of creativity in business, because Hollywood just loves a hit. You see how everything changes if something is a hit. And the numbers were huge. It generated a huge amount of other interest in what the BBC was doing specifically in this genre, and it made a lot of money. And then as far as your perception, I got then, having done almost no reality programming or Shining Forward programming in my life, got a call to do precisely that at NBC. So it's funny how your career changes with what looks like success,
So that was 2008, and you joined NBC as EVP Alternative Programming.
Yeah.
Again, what was the brief? And also, 2008 is important because it was a quite tumultuous time in the US. There was the general financial and economic situation. There was a new president. And also at the start of the year, the TV industry had been impacted by a writer's strike. And sort of in a resonance for today, the strike had probably given a platform for alternative or reality programming.
Really what the important thing about 2008 is, oh no, the world turned upside down financially. I mean, in a way that, it's hard to understand that, GE, General Electric, owned NBCU. And in the kind of, this is all part of like too big to fail, GE nearly went bust. Before I got the job, I had to go to New York and see the boss at the time. It was Jeff Zucker, okay? And Jeff said, look, the difference we're in 4th place now. The difference between 4th and 1st is one of these things that you've done before. Like our network, statistically, the way that network television works is like one show can change everything. Your job is to find that one show. Now, as it happens, Jeff literally left in the hours before The Voice was commissioned, because it took that long. And I can't remember when The Voice first went on. I think like 3 years later, 2011 or something. But he said the key it's nothing to do with the cost. It's nothing to do with the eyeballs, because one of these shows, when successful, is, if you think about the hour count of something like Dancing with the Stars, I think ultimately became like 50 to 60 hours a year of original programming. Well, that's 3 hit scripted series at a full load, right? I mean, if you have a show that's number 1, number 2, or number 3, back in the day, again, numbers were very different. He could see that would level up the whole network. So it was the brief was get it. Oh, you've got to do all of this other stuff. You've got specials, you've got the existing programs that are there, and you've got to also commission a few things to make money, and then find it. And actually, commission a few things to make money went really well for us, because that probably was the one thing that the writer's strike had done, was teach or educate the large media companies about precisely how many rating points and money were lurking in their unscripted hills. So the strike probably, and I say this because I know it's probably ongoing and slightly controversial, but I was always very concerned by the level of bravado that companies would have during the strike, because, oh my God, we made so much more money for not making scripted programs. Like the P&L was in the realms of the completely undeniable, where actually it was a brave thing for the networks to keep on piling money back into scripted at the time, because none of it stacked up unless it was a runaway success. So it was a really interesting time in America, massively hopeful, uplifting time as well, because of Obama's presidency, and then seeing the emergence out of the recession, and then and again going somewhere when it's on its knees and lifting it up, or being a part of being lifted up, is quite a nice place to be. So although it started extremely gloomily with a financial meltdown, real problems in the business, massive downturn in advertising, we slowly but surely kind of rebuilt something, and made a lot of people very happy, and made a lot of money.
You were responsible for some of the biggest formats in US television, including The Voice, which you mentioned, America's Got Talent, The Apprentice.
I didn't buy either AGT or The Apprentice. They were part of the incumbency.
Right.
I'm not going to claim I ordered those.
Okay, so in terms of then, if we break it down into its component parts, then managing those super brands and then bringing The Voice on board. So if we talk about bringing The Voice on board, what did you look for at that time in a format that would work for NBC? And how did you decide to proceed with the ones that really stood out?
Well, look, The Voice is in a class of its own. And I would say there are three words that make a name: John de Mol. Okay. But The Voice came from an expected place to find a massive hit, which is Holland, Hilversum, this weird, suburb of Amsterdam, where John de Mol and a handful of incredibly close creative and business associates built. I mean, talking about everything that matters in television for 30 years in real terms basically came from this guy's brain, with notable exceptions. Big Brother changed television forever in the UK. You know it, you were there. So this guy had game-changing franchise after game-changing franchise, leveraged out of Holland, which is this funny little homogenous country in the lowlands, but a perfect test bed for pop cultural phenomena for some reason. And I had heard, funny enough, from Craig Plestis, who was my predecessor in the job, who's now a very successful producer of things like Masked Singer. He'd gone down to MIPCOM at our expense because he was under an overall deal at NBC. And I said, anything interesting there? And he goes, well, Warners have got the new De Mol format. It's really the only thing anyone's talking about. It's called The Voice of Holland. And I said, well, we can't call it The Voice of America. That title's taken. And then we did some homework, and the homework being YouTube. But the spinning chair and the blind audition, that's a moment in time where, as an executive whose job is to find it, you saw it and you were like, oh my God, I'm an idiot for not having thought of that. Or how simple is that one core trick? And of course, they knew they had it because John de Mole's wasn't born yesterday. Anyway, through some corporate relationship, it was Warner's that was selling it. And they hadn't called. So I just got on a plane to Holland and had a meeting with John. And I threw myself at his mercy, or basically telling the truth, which is, look, mate, I grew up watching your sister, Linda de Mol, on TV. I have worshipped at the altar of, seeing Endemol as a credit on shows in my formative years. You're a hero of mine for what you've done. And it was all honest. Plus, I also said, and look, you want to be in a network that's in the toilet. Like, the only way is up for us. And what I can promise you is this will be made by the best, most creative team in the world, and that we will nourish it and we will spend money on it. And the reason is, I believe it will change the company's fortunes entirely. Anyway, he responded to this. We did a terribly expensive deal that obviously made him an enormous amount of money. Absolutely no regrets. We got that which Jeff Zucker had identified as it. And we would, at that point, both the competitive side in me, but also the genuinely creative side of me, had fully engaged in something. And I think the tenacity paid off. But what I would say is there were so many things that aligned to make it a success in the US that are trivialized by thinking that buying it or spotting it was what was important. 1,000 other really important things needed to go right for that thing to be a hit. So it was epic, really. It was fun.
And then going back to the other side of the ledger, then, in terms of managing the projects and the big brands that were already there, you had some very big A-type personalities on shows like America's Got Talent. And
Howard Stern, Simon Cowell. Howard Stern was absolutely epic experience for the whole company and everyone that worked on that show. Incredibly memorable years. Super high ratings, and we ended up making the show in Radio City for 3 years, which was just honestly a life-changing for everyone that happened to be working on the show.
So there was Howard Stern, Simon Cowell, and somebody called Donald Trump, who was at that point not president of the United States. How do you manage those relationships with these very high-profile and very type A type of personalities?
Okay, so look, I think nearly all human beings on planet Earth change when they've got 500 million in the bank. And there are plenty of people who are not famous who fall into this category, which is if your life is surreal from a point of view of the resources that are available to, live in multiple homes and fly between them in private jets, you have to assume that anyone that does that is not normal, okay? And not normal, it just means exceptional or different, okay? And that requires a very specific set of kind of management practices. You could call Howard Stern, Simon Cowell, please don't call Donald Trump, and ask them what was the main characteristic of your relationship. And I would say, not like radical candor or brutal honesty, but just like, no, my words are the truth. Your words should be the truth back. Now, no one's managed Donald Trump in his life, not even Donald. I bet if his dad was around, he'd manage. And, I have to separate Donald, the TV personality, from Donald, politician, or Mr. Trump, president. I don't know, he was always Donald to me. He was Mr. Trump to a lot of people, but I was the paymaster at the network, and he completely understood how important The Apprentice was to his brand. I can tell you, wherever he was the center of attention. Before he had any political ambitions whatsoever, you could be in a room full of stars, and he frequently was. And there'd be more people mugging for a photo with him, people who've probably hidden that photo now, okay? I wouldn't. But We did walk NBC red carpets. We didn't give him permission to do that. It wasn't us. It was the people that invited him. And you need to look at who invited him to parties and stuff like that. He was kind of a little bit mad, bad, and dangerous to know. And that was really where it began and ended as his TV persona. He played the part. He played it really well. It required a lot of support, just as any of the other people that we mentioned before require an awful lot of support to be on camera. Much is made of Donald's hair and makeup, let's just say. That is true of every not normal person in our business, okay? Ability to be on time, late, turn up, show up, all of these things, they are all part of managing those people. And it was unusual to say the least. And then in the latter stages, it was really extremely stressful and difficult for everyone to manage. And I think that a lot of people that were sort of in highly paid jobs on The Apprentice and all of that, looking around, wondering what the hell just happened. It wasn't a gravy train that was going to go on much longer anyway. The ratings were in substantial decline by the end of it. We were looking for ways to refresh it. I mean, we'd had the conversation about, is it time to look for a replacement for Donald on the franchise? We talked about putting his kids on almost every version of How Do We Keep the Dream Alive, because it's going down, down, down. But it was still big enough for him to have a massive platform. And, I remember that I always say there's an apocryphal when we talked to him about things. And when he realized that he had more Twitter followers than the New York Times had subscribers, he's like, I'm more powerful than the New York Times. I was like, it doesn't really work like that. And he goes, no, watch China, like tweets, it was interesting to say the least.
So you went on to become president unscripted, co-chairman, and ultimately chairman of NBC Entertainment. And one of your colleagues was a guest on the podcast recently, Kevin McClellan.
Yeah.
He said that he stopped being an operator when he reached chairman level at NBC Universal. And by that, his raison d'etre and operating style within the organization changed. Did you have the same experience in managing a business of that scale? So you become divorced from the operation and become a manager, and is that a very tough transition?
For better or for worse, the idea of me sitting at the head of the table, chairing it, was definitely a different mantle to wear, because I am an absolute eye level. I have zero sense of hierarchy in my life and in society. Whether you're young or old, you can have a good idea. Whether you're the grand poobah. I mean, I would talk to Steve Burke the same way I would talk to anyone. And I know that sounds like a sort of crass way of putting it, but it is the truth. Okay, so I'm largely fairly unfiltered in terms of a kind of conversation and a style of conversation within the guardrails, hopefully, normally of what's appropriate. But I am not a grand poobah, sit back and take in reports kind of person, because my instinct will be to, what's the problem? And then jump in with them on that problem. Chairman is a different mantle to wear, or chairperson. And even if you're doing it with someone else, which was a delight, doing it with George Cheeks was amazing, because that heavy mantle, it requires kind of two people propping it up, because just being wheeled around a bunch of, hey, what have you got on? Oh, you need to go here, 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 here. What am I doing? Just, what? Really? Just showing my face for 10 minutes and saying hi, and then going to the next opportunity to do that is literally not me. So one of the problems would be is if I went to do one of those things, I would just disappear off to AGT for an entire afternoon, cackling in the audience with them rather than doing my job, which is why there's a very, very strong pull of boots on the ground creativity, whether that was in the marketing department, ad sales department, is that I'm a hustler, not really a sit at the end of the table going, that'll do nicely indeed.
So can you talk about your new business, a new production venture, the Whole Spiel?
So look, I have, a very, very strong point of view about the evolution of distribution, the evolution of production, and the evolution of the business models that support our ecosystem. And I've also had the opportunity to watch, I think it's been a good 3 years since I left NBC. And I had a year, which I'll just say all of us had, the pandemic year. And then it's like, okay, well, what would I do now if I were apprised of all of the market information, all of the sort of trend and social and behavioral information, the business as I understand it, having absolutely seen NBC through its transition from being largely a linear to a fully digital distribution system and the dawn of Peacock and all of that sort of stuff. What would I do? So what the Whole Spiel seeks to do is harness the combined experience of some people who have had what I would say is like, I am multi-skilled in television. I've sold internationally. I've sat in those booths and those meetings where you're like, these people aren't buying this. I have pitched networks in the English language, networks in Germany, and networks in Japan. I have a strong sense of the global market. I've run commercially run two of the largest studios on the planet. And neither of them are making money, whatever they tell you. I just know the numbers, okay? And it's very hard to make money because ... of the structural reasons that are built in through the streaming wars, which basically just detonated anything that looks like profit for everyone on a show. One of the reasons why there's all this conflict was television, specifically by design, if it was successful, was meant to every single person, top to bottom on a production's life would change forever. Everyone benefits from things that are a hit. The problem is they don't anymore. Very, very few people benefit from something being a hit. Most of them are above the line. And that's where the money is. And so as these companies go through cutting their costs to the bone, they are going to have to look for programming alternatives that cost the right amount of money. One problem. They've got their consumer giddy and inebriated on a certain level of production values. Now, the good news is most of the things that are actual hits, Call the Midwife, or whatever on a global basis, like the British shows that pop in the numbers and things like that and look like real things, they are made at the correct economics. That's what a hit is. It's not one person on the show making a load and everyone else suffering, or not. That's rarely the case anyway. And so we intend on making within financial guardrails that guarantee that when a meeting is had between the distributor or distribution system, whether it's a streamer, a broadcast network, or someone selling something for you, the producers and the talent come together and go, aren't we doing jolly well doing this? And that will inevitably require, yes, some things to be made a certain way, made a certain volume. So what the Whole Spiel is intending to do is we're operating out of Berlin, London and Glasgow, Los Angeles. And we have what I'd say extremely strong affiliations across those countries and territories, both the careers, the people involved, my sort of associates in the company, and extremely strong Mexican and then Latin American connections. We are focusing on producing in English, German, and Spanish as language choices. We've got a slate of drama series. Most people are saying, aren't you Mr. The Voice? And I'm like, I did that for a bit of my life, but trust me, I've done other things. So I do have a couple of, we as a group have a couple of what I describe as sort of big unscripted swings that we're working on. But that is a small part of what we're doing. We're building a slate of series that for which our ambitions are fairly clearly stated. We'd like them to have strong creative engines and teams that can take them for at least 5 years, library building, and to do so efficiently with partners from all around the world. And the Whole Spiel is because you get it's sort of in the title, and probably as a result of listening to this podcast, there's normally a very good reason behind why we're doing something, but it's going to be a whole spiel. I mean, you have to listen. There's always an enormous amount of context to creative decisions that we make. And the other thing is, I think that when you have leadership that, let's just say, has experience, is prepared to accept the mistakes or errors you've made in a career, that's an incredibly valuable resource to the, I say, next couple of generations of producers or people as they're starting businesses. And so we're working with an exciting group of affiliated independent producers, and we provide the glue and the grease to those relationships, whether it's, oh, you know what, name dropping aside, most of the people that run platforms that can greenlight a TV decision will understand the email that I send them to ask for the meeting. And that's really where it begins and ends. It's that I'm enjoying being a producer of things that feel like I can get passionate about, and that will also help a whole load of people level up into the kind of access that I enjoyed because I had a BBC business card, or I enjoyed because I was briefly chairman of NBC. I do know what I know, and I know what I don't know. So that's kind of the whole spiel.
Very good. Well, I always like to end with another fun question. And so, talking about those connections and that experience, using your experience, if you could program a network schedule for one evening, which 3 shows that you were involved in would you choose for a Paul Telegdy night of programming?
I would say I would take the 2012 Super Bowl rated Voice, highest rated lead out of the Super Bowl ever, I think, still to this day. I don't know, prove that. Well, prove me wrong, but I think it's the cleanest flow out of a Super Bowl ever into the highest rated show ever after was The Voice. So I'll take that rating. I think that what I would like then is 2 half-hour comedies. And I'd like those to be out of the grand tradition of, won't claim credit for The Office, but I was there when it was first pitched to Jane Root. I was in the room, and I know what the decision-making thresholds were around it. It was fascinating to watch John Plowman go to bat for Ricky Gervais. That was what it was. By the way, this would be terrible flow on a demographic point of view, but I'll just take the size, okay? Like it would be 80, but I'll take take a 1 hour Voice into The Office and Parks and Recreation. They were rarely paired. They should have been, and they should still be on air making episodes if I had anything to do with it. Okay, so I would take those 2 shows because I think Parks and Recreation was talismanically important and our darkest hour at NBC, and it was going to be cancelled. And I had nothing to do with my job at the time, and I went literally to the ground for it. And my older kids, have loved that show unconditionally. So, and then from I think a good 10 o'clock drama. So, you know what? I had this question in advance that the 10 o'clock drama hour is most difficult. I would say Game of Thrones, and you would say, Paul, how were you involved in that? Well, that was damn nearly a BBC show. So I would say that it's probably not in the oral history of how the show came about, but I sort of know. And if I could have somehow, I would have stayed involved in that show, and I would put it on at 10 o'clock. And so you'd have probably 50 million people watching you on that night.
That sounds like an amazing evening of programming, which I'd definitely be watching. And just a couple of those stories make me think that I've asked some of the wrong questions, because all the interesting ones were all, just at the end there of all the stories that were untold. But we'll leave that for another time, perhaps. But anyway, Paul Telegdy, thank you so much for being a guest on the podcast. It's been fascinating. Great stories about the past. Looking forward to hearing more about the whole spiel. And I will say, rather than Viva Laughlin, Viva the whole spiel.
So sweet, Danny. Thank you. And I'm sorry for giving you your most difficult editing job today.